I'm going to be presenting today on work that I've been doing over the last 20 years. I'm unapologetically a clinical and forensic psychologist, and my presentation today is going to be unapologetically clinical assessment and forensic psychology. When I did my graduate training a long time ago, I was kind of a humanistic type of guy, somewhat Jungian and sort of math phobic. And over my career, I have gradually evolved. I got all the stuff that I should have gotten in graduate school, didn't have the head for, on methodology, research, design, and statistics. And I have grown to truly love them, and by learning how to move into that whole area, have deepened my knowledge. As a board-certified forensic psychologist, the behavioral science of the work that I do is what I really get paid for. And I'm going to argue in this presentation today that the behavioral science, or the forensic psychology of child custody evaluations, really is what gives value to the court. I've collected data on all the custody evaluations that I've done. And what we're going to see today is the product of some of that work that's in development right now and is currently being reviewed and being published. Child custody evaluations have been rather severely and continuously criticized by the psychology establishment for the last 20 years because of the lack of the behavioral science. So, for example, if we were going to compare custody evaluations to competency to stand trial evaluations, we're dealing with two very different kinds of things. These writers complain about the best interest of the child standard, stating that it is a vague, multidimensional, and impossible to actually create into a construct. And they criticize the methods that evaluators use based on a variety of surveys that have taken place over the last 15 years. You've probably read them yourself. Bow and Quinnell, Keelan and Bloom and Ackerman have all done surveys of what do custody evaluators use, what kind of techniques and tools did they use in gathering the data for their evaluations. There's this classic article by Tippins and Whitman, 2005, that really goes right to the heart of this issue, is how do we actually take custody evaluations and bring them into court and meet legal admissibility standards. One of the things that hardened up my position and stimulated me to push this harder is a very aggressive attorney in my jurisdiction who knows this stuff and can tear a custody evaluator apart simply on the whole issue of the behavioral science or lack of behavioral science in custody evaluation work. So the question is, can you turn custody evaluations into what's essentially a form of a psychological assessment? And can we bring the science and the methodology and the ways of thinking that characterize assessment psychology into what used to be called social studies, and before that, home studies? If you know the history of custody evaluations, you realize that they emerged out of social work. Originally, they were called home studies. They were done as adoptive home studies. I really wonder if there were even custody evaluations done in the 50s, for example. So I think custody evaluations are a new phenomenon, and if anybody's been watching the trends, it's pretty obvious that psychology has moved itself into the whole custody evaluation business, and I would say is actually taking it over in terms of design, methodology, and the overall orientation. I think you see psychology's input very heavily in the AFCC model standards. So again, going all the way back to criticisms all the way in the late 90s, can one draw empirically based conclusions with any semblance of scientific certainty? Now, Bill Austin actually makes the claim, and this is where you see the presence of psychology in AFCC's trends, is that actually a custody evaluation is a forensic mental health evaluation. And Austin actually says that custody evaluations may be the most complex and challenging of all forensic mental health evaluations. So I do insanity evaluations, I do testamentary capacity evaluations, I do guardianship evaluations, I do competency to stand trial evaluations, but I would say none of them even approach the depth and complexity of a typical custody evaluation. He says the amount of time involved, volume of data, and breadth of complex issues surpass almost any other type of forensic evaluation. The level and breadth of knowledge required of the evaluator to conduct a competent custody evaluation may be the most of any forensic mental health evaluation. That's an amazing statement. Now, if we begin to look at custody evaluations as fundamentally forensic mental health evaluations, all of a sudden it moves out of this area, wherever it's been before, into an area where we can actually consider it in terms of other forensic mental health evaluations. The takeaway issue here is that the quality of forensic reports submitted to judges are uniformly poor. Every survey that's ever come out on this and addressed this issue has shown consistently poor quality. And one of the primary reasons that reports are considered to be poor quality is the absence of a psycho-legal opinion, which is the rationale for the opinion or the recommendations. In other words, you make a recommendation, but the judge wants to know why. Now, if we are going to try to take the logic of assessment or psychological assessment and bring it to the task of custody evaluations, we run into a real significant problem right off the bat, which is the best interest of the child standard. The best interest standard is really a very complex entity. Obviously, when we look at a statute, the forensic assessment psychologist is looking at where we connect to the statute. In other words, the forensic psychologist has to know the legal standard and then apply an assessment method that addresses or brings it up to the legal standard. The other primary criticism of custody evaluations in general is our assessment methods. And these would include custody evaluations in which and I've seen them and I've heard them criticized and lampooned. You know, they send them off to see the custody evaluator and they did a WACE, a Rorschach, and a MMPI. Okay? I've read custody evaluations that do that. And generally these studies, these surveys of the types of tools that custody evaluators use have been confirmed by these surveys. Now, I'm going to argue that those tests, the Rorschach, the MMPI-2, and the WACE, actually do have a place in custody evaluations. And here's how I'm going to approach it. In 2002, Randy Otto and Kirk Halbrin published a very important article on forensic psychology. And they said that there's basically three types of measures that one can use in forensic psychological evaluations. First, forensic assessment instruments. These are called FAIs. If you're a competency to stand trial evaluator, you know which ones are out there. There's the MATCAT, there's the EXTER. If you do insanity evaluations, there's the Rogers Criminal Responsibility Scales. In other words, these FAIs have been developed in various domains of assessment. Second, forensically relevant instruments. And third, clinical measures and assessment techniques. So your FAIs are ones that are specifically designed to address the legal standard. I believe that we can approach the best interest standard using the framework from Tippins and Whitman in order to be able to develop evidence-based assessment procedures for all of the various components of child custody evaluations. And my point here today is that you actually don't have to be a forensic psychologist to do it. I'm going to show you some instruments today that are widely available, and they standardize the whole process. So my presentation today is, first of all, to present a conceptual model of the child custody evaluation process based on psychological research that lends itself to the use of empirically validated procedures. Second is to present our efforts to develop evidence-based procedures and findings in custody evaluations based on 20 years of CE experience in a program of research examining divorcing and non-clinical couples. I'm what's called a scientist practitioner. And in my practice, I essentially gather data. And so I've gathered all the data from my custody evaluations. And my students and I do dissertations and then publish the stuff. That's sort of what we do for fun. Ongoing research, our program includes self-other assessment of psychological adjustment and parenting in married and divorcing couples. Okay, that's a mainstream issue that we're doing right now, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a few minutes. And right now we've got a study going, appraisals, divorcing parents' appraisals of their children's psychological adjustment while they're going through custody evaluations. What I'm really focused on doing here is establishing the logic of the scientific method in custody evaluation methodology. It's a horrible word, operationalization, but operationalization is an amazing thing. It's where you take a concept or a phenomenon and turn it into a construct, and then develop measures for it, and then study the psychometrics of your measures to determine the construct validity, which is basically the search for reality. You see, I used to think psychology was this sort of dry, procedural thing, and actually research is the search for reality. It's a desire to know and to understand. So my goal here is to operationalize each component of the child custody evaluation process. What I want to do is describe to you some accessible and user-friendly, empirically validated assessment tools that are consistent with the AFCC's model standards. If you look hard at the model standards and take a real hardcore look at them, there's many, many areas in which they're making recommendations for which there is no behavioral science at this point, or it's very weak or it's not very well connected. I'm not the first person to go down this pathway, of course. There are others, and Jonathan Gould's book is one example. Now, so one of the guidelines that we're going to be using to bring ourselves to this, and this has to do with the idea that, at least I believe, that custody evaluators are experts. They should be qualified as experts and they should testify as experts. And in my jurisdiction, they do. Partly because I've been pushing them so hard. For many years, custody evaluators would be somebody standing in the hallway. And the judge says, well, is so-and-so outside? And they would appoint them. But obviously the standards are going up, up, up. There are 4 components in the federal rules of evidence, and these rules of evidence would be applied in your jurisdiction in one form or the other, that are really important, that I think are framework issues, and they include the following: knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education. Second, sufficient facts or data. Third, the product of reliable principles and methods. In my jurisdiction, up until recently, until now, custody evaluations are performed by attorneys. Attorneys don't have methodological tools. So all they can do is interview people. And therefore, yesterday I went to a really fine workshop in the morning in which hearsay, we spent the whole morning talking about hearsay and hearsay exceptions. Well, it turns out these evaluations are nothing but hearsay. He said, she said, he said, she said, he said, and she said, he said, she said. Okay, in other words, and when you read an evaluation like that, you're going, oh my God, it's just a bunch of hearsay. It's just a bunch of talk that people have made. And my belief is the custody evaluator should produce new data. Okay, I don't believe you can just do an evaluation based on he said, she said. The evaluator needs to produce original data in the assessment process. And third, whether sufficient facts and data are been applied reliably to the facts of the case. So this brings the whole issue of methodology to the fore. When I started making noise about this, and it began to catch on in the legal community, it made all the local custody evaluators extremely anxious. But here we see the same concepts of how do you address a methodology, bringing a scientific approach to anything that's going to be admitted as evidence in court. There are those three components at the bottom. Does your custody evaluation include sufficient facts or data? Did you use a reliable set of principles and methods to generate your data? And have you applied those principles and methods to the facts of the case? And the idea here is that when I'm sitting in my office and people are coming to me for assessment services, I'm like a scientist. And my office is my laboratory. And I'm using scientific methods to answer questions that are of grave interest to people, whether they're individuals, courts, families, and the use of a set of methodological tools that I'm using without apology. The local clinical scientist is an anthropologist, detective, and experimentalist all ruled in one. I'm proposing that we can take the child custody evaluation process and operationalize its components. There's three fundamental dimensions in the custody evaluation process: structural, developmental, and functional. So what they did is they basically deconstructed the best interest of the child standard into three broad areas. The relational assessment, needs of child assessment, and abilities of parent assessment. And then there's subdomains under each one. And at the bottom, you have the specific issues that will be assessed to address. And by starting yourself at the bottom of this table and performing your assessment from the bottom up, by the time you're done, the best interest of the child should emerge. So now we have a set of domains that we can begin to attach our assessment methodologies. For example, there's your relational assessment, parent-parent. So we can assess the parent-parent relationship. We can assess the parent-child relationship. We can assess the child's needs. And we can assess the abilities of each of the parent in relationship to those needs. All right. Now, let's start with parent-parent. How do you assess a parent-parent relationship? A large body of research has consistently shown that interparental conflict is maybe the single most powerful predictor of children's adjustment to divorce. In assessing the capacity for shared parenting, first of all, the quality of the relationship between the parents is going to be extremely important. What is the level of conflict, cooperation, and communication? Obviously, cooperation is a serious protective factor because it's very easy to assess the interparental relationship. Okay, by using a cross-informant research methodology, which is essentially you use a tool where each person rates themselves and they rate the other person on the same set of items. So it has to do with my self-view, your self-view, the way I see you, and the way you see me. And we use the Achenbach adult behavior checklists. Easy to use. The software's beautiful. It takes 15 minutes to give one. So the parent comes in, I give them 2 Achenbachs. I say, fill this one out about yourself and fill the other one out about the other parent. But generally speaking, people in custody assessments deny that they have psychological problems. That's a major issue because everybody's faking good. But then there's always an other devaluing bias in high conflict couples. And it always occurs in the externalizing behaviors, which is aggressive behavior, rule-breaking behavior, and intrusive behavior. Now, we've studied whether or not these are accurate representations of the other party, or do they represent a bias? And it's very likely even that the custody evaluation process can actually generate bias because it's a competitive situation. Let's move on to the parent-child assessment. How do you assess a parent-child relationship? First of all, several people have tried to develop scales out there. So there's the parent-child relationship inventory. I mean, they've tried. But if you've used any of these, you find that they're all face valid. And therefore, you're going to get a fake good response set. And so everybody has the most wonderful relationship with their child that you've ever seen. And essentially, they're normed on small samples. They've been usually developed privately. Big publishers haven't gotten behind them, and they're useless. Okay. All right. So here's a whole area in which there is just no behavioral science foundations or guidelines. So essentially, we have to fall back on interviewing, essentially, and collateral input. What is the history of the parent-child? And this is fundamentally done by interviews. Fundamentally done by interviews. Now, one thing that we could do is to standardize that interview process, and which I have done. All my interviews have become. I've been working on standardization on setting a set of questions. But remember, over standardizing everything has its downside too, because there's many kind of idiosyncratic qualities of the relationship between a parent and the child that are extremely important. We move on to needs of the child assessment. Here we're back on very solid ground. Parent, pretty solid. Parent-child, weak. Needs of child, strong. Okay? Because essentially the evaluation, this falls into the standard clinical assessment of a child, and we have many excellent tools for doing that. The psychosocial, academic, and developmental needs of each child, including wishes of each child where appropriate. Now, if you look at your list of 60 items, if you go down there, you'll see down around 21 or so wishes and needs of the child. What is it, 14 and older? So here we interview the child. We can take medical, physical assessment of child's development status, developmental assessment of child's psychosocial adaptation. We can get school records. We can use, like I said, academic assessments using collateral input. We can go over to the school and take a look at their records. The Achenbach system also includes the child behavior checklist, which is one of the most powerful assessment tools that's available in child psychology. And you can send an Achenbach TRF to the school, and this assesses the child's behavioral and emotional adjustment in the classroom. So essentially now we have all this nexus of information coming together. We can do a clinical assessment of the child. We can use standard psychological assessment of the child. In fact, I think we may even look at that. I oftentimes do psychological testing of children in custody evaluations because in my jurisdiction at this point, because I've been around so long, I never get easy cases anymore. I get picked for the worst cases. And I've had a half a dozen children with autistic spectrum disorders in the last year. And how does a custody evaluator How does a lawyer custody evaluator evaluate a child with autistic spectrum disorder? They can't. Okay? Then the question is, do they have the good sense to refer and use an expert for that critical question? Okay? So the assessment of children is maybe the easiest part of a custody evaluation. Now we go back out here into a murky zone. Abilities of the parent assessment. The assessment of the functional ability of each parent to meet the needs, including an evaluation of the interaction between each adult and child. That would include the parent's emotional stability, the parental history, parenting skills and knowledge, history of caregiving. All right, now we really come to the far domain, which is, how do you assess parenting? I'll be the first to admit that this may be where my major weakness is. But I might like to try to justify that weakness by saying to you that I believe that parenting and the assessment of parenting is not really being done in psychology. I think there are other disciplines that are more interested in this and may have the leading edge on it. How do we assess parenting? Is our assessment of parenting anecdotal? Is there an observer effect that was discussed earlier this morning? I do home visits. Having done 300 custody evaluations, that means I've visited 600 homes. I consider actually home visits to be one of the great privileges that I have, okay? Because I really like going into people's homes. And I found out later that everybody always just tears the house up and cleans it up before the custody evaluator comes. This kid told me the other day, God, they worked all day, before you came over. So there's a huge amount of theatrical facade effects, right? Don't assume that they cleaned it up before you got there, no doubt about it. And everybody's putting on a big show about what a good parent they are. So, if we were going to use the approach that I'm taking here, what kind of conceptual model do we want to first of all establish upon which we would build our assessment approach? And I would think obviously here it would be a competency-based model. A competency-based assessment, for example, is really big right now in graduate education of psychologists. Okay, it's coming out, APA is coming out with it. By defining the specific competencies, they think that they can do a better job of both teaching competencies and evaluating them. If we were going to develop a measure of parenting, we would have to consider content, criterion, and predictive validity. And then content would be, what is the domain of information that we would include in assessing a parent? It's an overwhelming task. Can you assess parenting by a paper and pencil test or questionnaire? Absolutely not. As anybody that knows what it's like to be a parent knows that parent is all about in vivo experience, right? It's wild being a parent. Being a parent and being in a family is a continuous emergency when you have children. At least the way it was in my house. I don't know. Yeah, it's a continuous emergency. It's constant. A parent has to be really on their feet all the time. And then you have that whole artificial framework of the custody assessment to start with. Nevertheless, there are efforts undergoing right now to attempt to develop approaches to in vivo parenting. These are being done in laboratory parenting situations, and this is just superb research of essentially doing parental interactions behind one-way mirrors. Family therapists see it all the time, and they've developed a coding system for how to do it. It's just in early development. Since I don't have a good parenting measure, I've fallen back on an alternative, which would be, can parents assess each other? How do parents assess each other as parents. And this is a part of the research that we're doing right now. First of all, we assess each parent's appraisal of the other parent's skills and conduct as a parent and how they see themselves as parents. I know that when I'm doing a custody evaluation, anecdotally, and I ask the person, well, tell me about the other parent. And they actually endorse some positive qualities in that person, then I know that I got something that's very different than to say, well, the other parent's a jerk and a sex abuser and a domestic violence perpetrator, and he's awful and he should die, and his soul should burn in hell. I mean, I hear that. Okay? So, what we did was developed a scale. This is my best attempt on how to do this, and the thing is under the process of development. But first of all, the question is, how do we operationalize parenting as a construct? So we developed the Self-Other Parenting Assessment Test, SOPAT. And this comes all out of my head, okay? First of all, if we're going to think about parenting involves two components: knowledge and action. Okay? So, for example, knowledge would be, what do you do if your kid throws up or has a temperature? How do you treat a cut? Okay? How do you cook? All right? Knowing, though, is different than behaving. So this is my first major components: knowing and conduct. Second is, I thought about it for months and finally figured these are the domains that my effort to capture the domains of what parents need to know and what they need to do has to do with safety, nutrition, medical health, discipline, education, socialization, recreation, and emotional well-being. How do you support your child's emotional well-being? Okay, so those are my components. And I added some personal attributions: a person's moral character, self-control, level of hostility, level of friendly parent communication, and co-parenting attitude. This is not quite right. And basically what it does is it yields, and this is a questionnaire that each parent fills out about themselves, and they fill out about the other parent, and we use it put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And it produces a global parenting knowledge, parenting conduct, and parenting competence scores, and scores on each one of these domains. So now we go to parent-child assessment. The AFCC model standards specifically state that the custody evaluator should include observations of parent-child interaction. I do structured observations, office-based, with behavioral coding, and this is where your next handout is going to come into play, and home visits, which are in vivo visits. Home visits or other settings. One of the obvious things here is that there has to be a certain degree of economy in the conduct of a custody evaluation. In other words, you're going to charge a fee for it. At least I do, and I'm going to try to create a package of procedures that are standardized in every case, and so things don't completely run wild, because it's not the only thing that I'm doing. Sometimes I'll be doing 3 or 4 custody evaluations at a time. Okay, so the question is, how do you create a standardized procedure that covers all the bases back there in the rules of evidence, and yet doesn't bankrupt you in running your business? The in vivo observations of child interacting with others, including parents and siblings and other children in a naturalistic setting. You may have been around a few years ago when there was a a major controversy over play therapy techniques in family court. A friend of mine and colleague of mine, a social worker who's a master sand tray clinician, had the temerity to send an article to the AFCC newsletter about sand tray techniques and child custody evaluations. And she got shredded. Okay? Martindale went after her. I wouldn't want Martindale coming after me. Okay? Okay, and the only reason I'm saying this is because this is all public. It was published, the response to it was published in the newsletter, and it was also written up in an article in the Journal of Child Custody. For good reason. The clinical research shows that framework that the lady described in the back actually is the most fundamental structural approach that has good reliability and validity. So here's what I do. I have a large set of Duplo blocks in my office, or large Legos. I have a big 3 baskets full. I bring them into the office and I say, I want you to build something with this set of Duplo blocks. After you are finished, I want you to show me what you built. Okay? So there's a task that's imposed. Now, some of the other approaches take a child versus parent. I'm kind of doing a parent from the beginning. Parent, I'm kind of saying this to the parent. You will build something with your kids. This is not a play session. There's a task. After about 25 minutes, that's usually enough. Sometimes I'll let it go on. It's called showtime, which is, okay, first of all, did they complete the task? Did they stay on task? And what did they build? And I oftentimes will have the siblings together in the session. And I want to see, and then there's the cleanup. Okay, guess what's next? Cleanup time. I want you, parent, to help you clean up. Help child clean up. In the clinical literature, this is the one where you get the action. Okay? In the literature, this is where you get the action. Because the parent has to impose a task on the child in vivo. Now, there are wonderful coding systems now in the process of development. This one right here is the one that's on your handout. So for many, many years, I just did my own observations were just, actually I got trained in graduate school how to code behavior, which I absolutely loved, using, coding behavior using a stopwatch and a grid in a nursery school. But I just was doing kind of loose observations. But when I found these approaches and began to incorporate them in my thinking, man, all of a sudden it's like I had a new set of eyes in watching a parent-child interaction. It was like it gave me a whole new set. It was like going from 16 pixel to 250. All of a sudden I could actually see things in front of me that I'd never seen before because I had a framework. And this system I hear is so sweet. And it's available just free. The dyadic parent-child interaction coding system, and by the way, this is also related to a whole field of child therapy called parent-child interaction therapy, which is a very sophisticated approach to therapy. A coding system that measures the quality of parent-child social interactions is being developed by Sheila Iberg at University of Florida. And here's your handout. Okay, so let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so these are used by permission. We don't get good audio, and you're going to ask the question, well, watch. So I walk in, give the instruction, I go over in the corner and sit down. Now you may ask, gosh, you're doing it right there in the office, right in front of them. That's got to create this. The parents kind of. This is the sort of oppositional parent. It's kind of going, whatever, you know. I say no, just do it. I get. That's why I was standing there saying, I want you guys to build something with the Lego blocks, and when you're done, I will ask you to show me what you've built. And then Dad was kind of going, what should I do? What should I do? And I said, I want you and the kids to build something together with the Lego blocks, and I repeated the instructions. And it's not like I'm really not interested in discussing this. This is just the instruction. And I retreat into the corner. Yes. Yeah. Now, you may say, gosh, doesn't this create a terrible reactivity effect of the presence of the evaluator? It doesn't. Okay? After you sit there for a little while, you'll start to see what's going on. Okay? In this particular instance, it turns out that this boy is autistic. Okay? And I think that we actually get a real sample of actual parent-child and sibling interaction that's valid. All right? I mean, you could argue with me about it. Obviously, the ideal setting would be in a room behind a one-way mirror. I just don't have it. And I've done now maybe 100 of these, and they always yield information that's useful. That's my office. You know what? I don't do play observations with older kids. I interview them. That's a good question. Say again? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't. That's a very good question. You know, where do I make the cut? 9, 10, maybe. I'll interview 6-year-olds or 5-year-olds individually. So now I'm scared to death about what's going to happen if I. All right. So that's how I do a parent-child observation. I'm sitting over there with the coding scheme, and I'm taking notes. I have been. Yeah, I have been. It's so easy now. It's so easy to document. In fact, the technology has just increased. Now you can just do it with an iPhone and get beautiful video. And you can code this. This is a codable interaction. This boy here never participated in the interaction in a participatory manner throughout. He's kind of on the periphery. He watches a little bit. He comes in and out, and then I have mom's observation too. So here's the same family with mom. Again, used by permission. Some people walk in there and go, "What? I'm not going to get down on the floor." Or, so here's where I'm having to fuss with okay, so they get going. Most of the time, they just go right at it. And sometimes, we get there's enough blocks that they can build elaborate. It requires, cooperation to actually build a project. Otherwise, sometimes you just get a mess. Okay, and I did this evaluation once of this extremely high status people, and the kid built a skyscraper. It's like, wow, look how big it is, and then it all fell down. Yes. Yes. There is an order effect issue that of concern. sometimes the kids will, the second time will come just right in and go right at it. This is not a perfect approach. I don't think there's any reason. Okay, so I've already mentioned that the tools for assessment of children are pretty straightforward. Yes, I use projectives. Okay? The Rorschach has now been completely reconceptualized into the RPAS system. It's beautiful. It's better than ever. I've defended the Rorschach in federal court under the most intense pressure. Okay? Don't believe everything that you've been told. It's a lot of garbage out there. Okay? I'm a Rorschach. I've published extensively in the Rorschach. I've been presenting and teaching it. It is still, in my view, the most sophisticated clinical tool that we have available to us. And all those criticisms now have been brought in and used. They're teaching graduate students that it's garbage, it's wrong. The kinetic family drawing is a powerful tool in assessing a child. Draw a picture of your family. Now, do you have to use Tippins and Whitman as our approach for how much we extract from that and what level? Here's the tools that we use for parents. And then this next section here is really basically going through Tippmann and Whitman's approach. And I'm just not going to drag ourselves out because I think it's time for us to try to talk a little bit. It's a very, very useful approach for stratifying levels of observation according to level of certainty. Now, remember I told you at the very beginning of the presentation that the chief concern that judges have, at least they've told me, and surveys have shown, is the absence of a psycho-legal rationale is considered to be a primary fault of reports. The judges tell me, you know what, your opinion is okay, I'm glad to hear your opinion, but I want to know why you think that. Please describe your reasoning and your justification. That's what I call the psycho-legal rationale. So I actually put a whole lengthy psycho-legal rationale section into my reports. These are what are identified as risk factors in a proceeding. And then there is the roadmap right out of Jameson et al. That's the handout. You can literally write it in here, the result of your report. Right, there's a paragraph here, a paragraph here, a paragraph here, a paragraph here. And by the time you fill all that out, when you get here, you're really in a very good position. You're in a much better position because you had a systematic, organized approach to going about the task. You have all of that data available, and then obviously it doesn't relieve you of the moral anxiety of having to make a recommendation, but it's a lot easier to have evidence that supports any conclusions that you reach. How to improve your report quality? Use clearly delineated sections and headings. Standardize your procedures. Separate observations from inferences. Provide a psycho-legal rationale, and to quote the Honorable Judge last night, who said, analysis is critical. Okay, this is exactly the whole goal of the psycho-legal rationale. And we have a set of... So, okay, so the speaker here said that she uses a technique of when involving adolescents and adults and parents in a discussion task to get an in vivo sample, okay, of parent-child interaction and communication. It's a great idea. In other words, what we're aiming for is in vivo sampling. I have found these to be complicating factors in creating a parenting plan. Most of them have pretty good sound evidence. Okay? Most of them have sound evidence underlying each one of these. You may have a big one is what I call sex issues. You know, custody evaluators are having to deal with porn, sex abuse allegations, the sort of penumbra of sexual impropriety. Many, many cases involve frank infidelity. Of course, you deal with this every day. But I have found that each one of these presents its own level of complication in the formulation and the potential effectiveness of a parenting plan. And so by bringing that up to the judge's attention or to the attorney's attention, I'm labeling, I'm putting red flags. What I've given you today, I realize it's difficult to adopt somebody else's methodology, but essentially I've given you the framework for how to do a custody evaluation using the conceptual framework here. And this is where it all comes down. I just borrowed it shamelessly from these authors, saying they've decomponentized, excuse that language, the best interest standard into these 4 factors, into these 8 subdomains. And I can assess each one of those, integrate the information, and bring it together. I'm always appointed by the court, either by a judge or by stipulation, and I provide copies of the reports to counsel. I've been going back and forth for years about whether I want them to do factual corrections, error corrections. It's like asking to go into a swamp. But I make it very clear, because otherwise then we don't have to have a squabble on the stand later on about whether you didn't get this date right or you didn't get that name right. And then we file them. And that's it. Now, I'm just moving into an area of exploring feedback sessions with the parents, but I've done a few of them, but not systematically. I would say about 75% or 80% of my cases settle. Yeah. And the question is, I catch hell of when I don't make recommendations. I'll just say, here are the scenarios, and I believe that the judge ought to decide, and then the judge and the lawyers are always pissed off. Because they say, because you didn't make recommendations, this case won't settle. So there's always that tension that it's not solvable. So sometimes I'll make recommendations. Other times I will give ranges of options that seem to emerge out of the data. Very good question. How do you operationalize home visits? Great suggestion. That's great. That's a weak area. I do them unstructured. I tell the parents, and there's all kinds of ways to do the home visit, and the social work literature is just deep on that. My structure is I'm here today to visit and hang out with you for a while, and to be with you and your family, see your child, and get a home tour, and just to be here. And most of the time it works really well. Sometimes I will conduct some follow-up interviews at the time of the home visit because there's follow-up stuff. In a few home visits, I've made the mistake of actually engaging in substantive issues, and sometimes I felt like I wasn't sure that I was going to get out of the house alive. Okay, so sometimes maintaining a certain degree of neutrality in that process is important. Like, don't ever talk about the other party's attorney in favorable terms. Bad mistake. Okay, and don't even talk about the other parent in favorable terms, because sometimes they'll come at me. The question is, how do you actually see? I will actually do a kind of an ecological assessment. So I'm interested in the neighborhood, nearness of grocery stores, playgrounds. So the question here is, there's home visit checklists that are readily available. Okay, where you can actually in adoption home studies is where you would get your guide there. Okay, adoptive home studies, very sophisticated type of work. It's really improved over the years, And they've begun to become more method-based in their approaches too. So, so do you do unscheduled home visits? I don't. Okay, CPS does. All right. CPS will go and visit a house without announcement. I don't think I can get away with that. Do I look in the refrigerator? I do. Do I open closets? I do. But you can see what people's homes are like. The lady says here that the question about staging for the custody home visits for the custody evaluator and the inability of people or how much they can actually change. And actually, I found that's more likely the case. I just did a case just recently where the mom was a hoarder. Wow. Okay, we went into that place and it had a series of little pathways through the house, with everything stacked to the ceiling. Kid seemed to be happy there. He had his own room and he was quite pleased, but the father thought it was just horrific. The question is, can this model be applied to parenting capacity evaluations? Answer, yes. I do a lot of them. That would have been my solution to the case last night. Okay? I would have done a parenting capacity assessment of Dad, because that judge said, I want evidence. Okay? And a parenting capacity assessment with the information that they're trying to get in about attachment and father involvement can all be done through a parenting capacity assessment, and I don't have any problems with the concept of being a retained expert. There seemed to be a lot of anxiety about that last night. Okay, look, we better stop. It's 12 o'clock. Thank you very much for your attendance.